welcome to another episode of Money for Nothing, the podcast about music and capitalism. I'm Saxon Baird with Sam Backer as always. And yeah, coming in a little late this time, but go ahead and just blame a couple busy schedules and the holidays. So we apologize. But on today's episode, actually, before we dive into today's episode, I'm going to say this at the top of the show. Please subscribe to our newsletter at Money for Nothing. That's the number 4.substack.com. Rate and review us, tell a friend, all that good stuff. It helps get the good word of Money for Nothing out there.
It truly does.
It actually
if you're
does.
listening to this and say like, oh man, I listened to this podcast and I have not yet rated and reviewed. Really, think about it. You could have done it already.
You could have done it already. Yeah.
You could have done it already. We're not telling you how many stars to give us, but the correct answer is, of course, 5.
5. Yeah. 5. 100%. Yeah. So on today's episode, we are turning our gaze onto Merlin or Merlin Network. And no, we don't mean the wizard. We mean the self-described most trusted international digital music licensing partner for independence. And by independence...
And if that doesn't roll off the tongue, I don't know
sure
what to
does
tell
it.
you.
Yeah, sure does. Yeah. And by independence, they largely mean independent labels. We've mentioned Merlin a lot on this show, but we've never actually done like a dive into like what Merlin is, who Merlin is, what does Merlin do, why does Merlin exist in the first place. And so that's what we're doing on today's episode. And I think before we get into the background and history of Merlin, I think that like one motivating factor behind doing an episode on Merlin is this question of like what it means when we say independence or independent labels or indie music or independent band. And, we've kind of circled around this question on past episodes.
They brought up a lot, I think, in like the discourse about major labels and the discourse of kind of like what, the stamp of authenticity and a discourse of like the relation, and increasingly in this kind of like everyone's doing more and more clearly like right in a post-streaming world. Lots of people are doing things that labels used to do. And so they are at some level more independent in that there's, every once in a while there's a horror story of like a major label being like, no, we will not release that album. But there's a lot more people like determining like what clothes they're wearing to the photo shoot than there used to be. But what does that mean from a more structural sense, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that we've kind of circled around this question a lot about like what it kind of means in a modern context of like what it means to be independent. But we never actually really addressed it head on, nor have we really addressed Merlin and like what it is, as I mentioned. But I would say that like probably over the past decade and a half, like what it means to be quote unquote independent in the music industry has like also shifted dramatically, as you were suggesting. And just kind of add what you were saying, like, you can't lump acts like, let's say, Blood Orange or The National or like labels like 4AD and Domino with your local cassette label putting out, grindcore or like experimental darkwave or something.
Dude, Blood Orange or The National, Adele.
Yeah, Adele. Or if you want to get crazy here,
Vampire Weekend.
Fucking Bad Bunny.
Yeah. Though,
like Bad Bunny's on a label out of Puerto Rico called Remus. Probably saying that with an extremely poor accent, but it's considered a quote-unquote independent label. Now, I'm not sure whether Remus is linked with Merlin, and, we'll get into, like, what Merlin does and everything, and I guess it is. But I think that, like, our attempt to deconstruct the who, what, when, and why of Merlin, I think we are also deconstructing, like, what the fuck independent means now, and not just what Merlin is in 2023. And I think what we'll see is that a distinction is actually already being made. I've been seeing it a lot this year, particularly in conversations around Spotify, that now there's a distinction being made between what is being called DIY. So, your local suburban SoundCloud trap producer or punk cassette label, and then the like, independent members of Merlin. So anyways, before we get too far into this, let's rewind a bit and just like let's offer a little bit of background on like the origins of Merlin, what the hell it is, and then we can kind of like dive into what it's become and its role as a major player, and even it's been called a fourth major in this musical ecosystem. So I think that a real inflection point, which is also the start of Merlin, really occurs around 2006, 2007, and that's when you kind of start to see maybe bands that were kind of traditionally known as indie, like a Modest Mouse or something, start like getting radio play or like more popular. But like so, and 2007 is like when Merlin forms, right?
Yeah. And I think it's also worth even, just thinking through like the kind of broader, like even the broader history behind it. And this is, fairly well known, right? That we've talked about this a lot. You get this, there's a thriving indie ecosystem in the 1980s, which looks rather different. And I guess this is probably a touch point that we'll return to several times in this episode about like, it looks kind of different. Clearly, it looks incredibly different today for many reasons. One of them is that they're physically selling actual pressed things, which has all kinds of ramifications throughout kind of like throughout the potential structure of the industry, right? One of them is that it's possible to have kind of this self-contained set of like independent labels that sell a lot of records in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, we talk about Fugazi a lot, but like they sold a ton of some of those records. Similarly, Lookout sold a tremendous number of Green Day records, or Epitaph sold a ton of Offspring records. And while like a lot of those bands eventually go to sign to majors, partially just because the indies can't handle it, you do get this thriving subculture. Some of those bands get bought up. Some of them stay kind of medium-sized throughout, I think, the mid-90s. And then kind of, I would say, like, what happened at one level, a bunch of bands kind of moved away. And another level, musical cycles change. Like, as I look out across, like, the streets of New York and see people in honest-to-God Jinko jeans, it's like, oh, there is nothing new under the sun. Sometimes it just takes a decade or two for things to come back. So like, right, there's this wave of independent bands in I would say that kind of on these moderately successful labels that are able to make a living, right? Because while Sebadoh or Dinosaur Jr., let me put it this way, while Dinosaur Jr., who signs to Warner, never sells Nirvana records, and Sebadoh never sells Dinosaur Jr. records, they still sell a bunch of records, right? And so like you can make like a decent, K Records and all these Matador, early Matador, all these labels make enough money to kind of keep this whole thing going. And then I would say kind of almost a decade later, right? Like 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, you start getting this new wave of bands who many ways kind of draw from aesthetically the music, draws from the kind of like post-punk with hooks that's kind of running alongside grunge, right? Like Archers of, like, Modest Mouse don't exist without Archers of Loaf, I would argue. And alongside that, also a lot of these bands came out of the same general ecosystem. So they're signed, or bands like them are signed to this kind of wave of labels, many of whom came out of that first movement, right? So Sub Pop is selling records again. Epitaph is selling records again. Matador is selling records again. Merge is selling records again. And so you do get this movie. So they're able to kind of use some of that previous infrastructure and kind of slot into a new audience that's really eager to hear those sounds. And I think that one of the interesting things is it's hard to untangle here, and maybe impossible to untangle here, right? Like, what is industry conditions? What is kind of cultural flows? And what's like I don't know, like, not to get like too esoteric maybe, but this like Raymond Williams has this idea like structures of feeling, like the mixture between social dynamics and aesthetic, like that the atmosphere of a moment that can kind of like operate along a bunch of different potential axes. And so like it does seem to me that like whereas early 90 bands in that grunge crossover moment were like either you're independent or you're mainstream, what you get in the 2000s is a series of bands and labels that have kind of made their way, earned some kind of institutional legitimacy, institutional longevity. They've been around for 10 years now. A lot of them have signed various kinds of distribution deals over the previous time. Clearly, they've survived a major infrastructural switch in music, which I'm not talking necessarily as much about the move to downloading from physical sales, but also just the kind of like centralization of American record buying that happens prior to the move to digital sales, right? So like they're like figuring, like I bought some of these records in a circuit city, which means that they knew how to get into circuit city, right? They had the distributors, they had the networks, because they've been around for a while. And it seems to me that like it was a cohort of bands and a moment that cared a lot about the aesthetic, but less strongly about like clear, fast and hard dividing lines, because in some ways it didn't seem to matter as much, right? It was possible to be kind of in this very kind of brief, but you know, not that brief, like moment, it was possible to be like quirky, like Russian constructivist referencing art, pop, funk, whatever, post-punk people like Franz Ferdinand and have a number one album. And like, it didn't seem like you had to choose maybe in this moment, or that choice didn't seem in some ways it's like very much like a early 2000s story. It's like it's all neoliberalism, baby, and we don't have to choose because kind of the choice is made, and it's possible to like be weird and sell records.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of something else though, which is kind of relates, is that it, on the flip side of it, it also kind of like marks the sort of last gasp of this accusatory like sellout culture, which I think was like still happening, as of even like the late 90s, that like, a band that would make the jump from a quote unquote independent label to a major would be considered a sellout. Or even like an independent band, like say, Green Day happening to score a music video on MTV. Oh, it must be selling out. Oh, it's like a sellout. But we see that argument, we don't hear that argument anymore at all. And I think that's partially because of the fact that of kind of things you're saying as well, where it just like suddenly like that hard dividing line started to like really get erased by the cultural moment. But I think there are other contributing factors.
I mean, I also think that it's important to be very specific about what kind of music we're talking about here. And
100%.
Right, like there's a classic Sasha Frere Jones piece, The Unbearable Whiteness of Indie Rock, or something along those lines. And like, it's a very specific cohort. And this is not true across the board, right? There are numerous important bands with members of color, but like and rightly or wrongly, some of these bands got kind of like tagged, but there's this aesthetic that read in a very specific way, or was read, and had exclusionary tendencies as well. But I think more generally, like, if we think about kind of the racialized dynamics of American music listenership, which is not hard and fast rules, but kind of like general trends, not always, clearly not throughout its history, but certainly by the 80s, like 70s, 80s, rock tended to be a whiter musical style. And by the 90s, right, there are major chart-topping black musical forms, both in terms of R&B and in terms of rap. And the center, right, there's been many last gasps of rock, but like you could argue that the last gasp of rock is the absolute dominant form, or a dominant form in American popular musical culture, is grunge. After kind of that bubble and then burst, partially because a lot of those bands are actually pretty weird, you get kind of a splintering of rock music, what I call like a deltification, Like, I don't know if you counted up all the different subgenres of rock, how it would like how it would stack up against other kinds of musical listening. Probably be less, but like there stops being an aesthetically viable, at least from like a critical perspective, an aesthetically viable mainstream rock, which really is a huge, I think, like in the discourse and the ideology, a huge difference, right? Like the underground won, and the underground hated the mainstream, and then the underground collapsed, and then they're like, what was the mainstream? Nickelback, right? Especially when the alternatives are like Dr. Dre or Biggie, like fabulous pop music. So, I mean, I do think another interesting thing about this moment of indie rock triumph that like kind of sets the stage for Merlin, kind of sets the stage for this world a little bit, and that also kind of sets the stage for this changing definitions of indie, is like this is the kind of the triumph of indie rock within a much smaller rock universe than had previously existed. And so you can list like the biggest bands who are on indie labels. It's like, you know, Franz Ferdinand, Arctic Monkeys, White Stripes, Libertines, Grizzly Bear, Arcade Fire, Vampire Weekend. Those sold a lot of records, but not compared to like
the Chronic 2001.
yeah. Or not compared to like the Carter 3, you know? Like, and probably when we're talking about like independent labels in this conversation, like we're not talking about Cash Money, because Cash Money, an independent label, signed a distribution deal with a major because they wanted their music into every single possible like American orifice.
Hip hop started dominating.
and in the UK, right, dance music becomes increasingly important.
Right, which we see now, which is like, you know, obviously how it's dominant force now. Right. Interesting. Yeah. So this kind of like sets the stage for so we take this, right, and then there's also something happening, which is a major technological change.
Right.
Right. Shift.
So what you have is this moment where like there's this cohort of labels that have done pretty well by themselves, actually, in this. They're not exclusively rock labels. Like XL Records is not exclusively, or Warp, right, which are big members of the kind of like Merlin cohort, are not exclusively rock labels, but a lot of them are fairly like Domino Records. You know, like they're fairly big, what you think of as like indie rock, like with an IE or a Y or however you spell it. Just indie, INDI, like a maniac.
Why, if you're in the like the English, what do they call it? If you're in the Commonwealth, i.e., if you're in the States.
So I think you have this moment where these labels have done pretty well for themselves, but they're also seeing kind of the writing on the wall. And by the writing on the wall, we mean like the fact that CD sales are cratering, and figuring out how to come up with new cash flows is a little bit difficult. Now, I do want to like, it's interesting, again, thinking about this like indie moment. My gut is these are also bands that probably benefited from the early music downloading economy, right? Like, a lot of bands, like there was this kind of like no one making money, but like democratization of the internet, right? Like famously, Arctic Monkeys give away their like first demo recordings, and they get downloaded like 600,000 times in a week or something. Because frankly, those 19-year-old kids really wrote a good set of songs. Wild. Have you ever seen like the YouTube of them like performing when they were just out of high school? They're children, and you're like, oh sir, you're a fully developed songwriter. Like even like Alex, whatever his name is, like had like a old man, like old man 19-year-old vibe, like harder than almost anyone I've ever like off the jump, harder than like anyone I've ever heard. Like even Bob Dylan's first album, right? Like, because Bob Dylan went like young man, old man pretty fast. Bob Dylan's first album is like, he's a cutie pie, you know? And he's like talking about like early Arctic Monkeys are like divorce songs. And I'm like, sir, you're 21. Like you've dated a girl in high school, maybe.
Alex Turner, the old soul of the Arctic Monkeys.
But right, so like these are also bands, and it's interesting to think about whether this move, and that I would say the relative canniness of this move reflects the fact that this is a set of labels that really realize that A, they're going to get cut out of this digital economy if they don't do something about it, and B, that like the internet's incredibly powerful. Like remember, they get started in 2007.
Merlin.
Merlin gets started in 2007. The iTunes store only hits the UK in 2004. Famously, and this is interesting and kind of gives you a sense of the problems they're up against, the iTunes store hits the UK in 2004 without a single independent artist on it because they didn't have a licensing agreement.
Well, that's fucking wild. But before we jump into there, let's just maybe real quick describe like what makes up Merlin. Like who? So when Merlin forms in 2007,
yeah, and it starts forming in
about?
2005. It has like an advisory committee, and then kind of takes a year or two to get going. But basically, it's a non-profit industry organization. This is when you know, ladies and gentlemen, that you're really in the weeds when you're starting to like do your industry organization deep dives. You know, because they're so important, and I think they actually like mask their influence on the world by just being like hiding in invisibility cloaks of boredom. Right? Like, it's so dull that you can't pay attention to, like, the meat lobby. Because they're just, it's like, what is it? Is it a conspiracy? Like, no. It's like a bunch of people just, like, talking to each other. Like, their minutes are available. Like, there's no there. And yet, it's a general. Folks who want to understand the 20th century look to the trade organizations.
Yeah. No, it's funny because doing research for this, I was like, you know, I'm thinking, I don't know, for some reason in my head, you know, I'm thinking Merlin. I'm thinking, oh, yeah, you know, like former, like, you know, punk new wave kids who, like, you know, were in bands who, like, started a label. And we're like, you know what? We're going to get fucked out of the streaming, like, economy. Like, we need to get together. And you're like, well, actually, this is, like, an extremely powerful and organized organization. Like, holy fuck.
and right, and it's interesting. I think that's a really good point, which is that, like, if you have made it, like Beggars Group is a major part of this, which is a major UK label that has a whole bunch of different kind of sub-labels, Beggars Banquet among them. It comes out of punk new wave, has made it through like decades of music industry. And you don't survive as an independent label for that long without having... like without growing up and like professionalizing and really
being competent,
being good at what you do. Yeah, so they seem like a deeply competent group of people, and they're all these labels that have been around for a while and often are like consortiums of other labels or distributors in and of themselves. And basically, it's a non-profit trade organization. These various labels sign with, and that basically negotiates on behalf of them in order to strike deals with various sorts of like digital rights users, right? So
and licensing.
Yeah, digital licensing, right? All the different kinds of licensing you can imagine. So like Spotify or YouTube or TikTok or Twitch or on and on and on and on and on. And basically
a bunch of platforms we've never heard of in like all over the world, like Australia, Africa, Asia, yeah.
And so basically, right, like they I think see from like a fairly early point that they're gonna get there needs to be like, and this is kind of a one of the first points where it's like a clear difference between physical sales and digital sales. Besides, like, one's a thing and one's like a packet of file transfer protocol. That's what I'm talking about, right? Like, structurally, one of the major differences is that, yes, you need some licensing in order to press vinyl, but sort of like to sell vinyl in my store, like someone needs to can show up, and famously, right? Think about like the 50s chess records, small scale R&B. Like, I could show up, or frankly, like the rise of grime and like DJ white labels. I can show up at your record store with the trunk of my car filled with product that you can buy from me either outright or on consignment, and like that's it. I don't need lawyers involved. Oftentimes in the music industry, I desperately don't want lawyers involved, or like the IRS, or whatever the British version, the Exchequer. I don't know what the British version of the IRS is. The Queen, like
the Queen.
But like, in order just to like get your material, your label's material on a streaming service, you need to sign these deals. And oftentimes there's kind of two ways to do this, right? One is like, I'm sure that these streaming services have like a Joe Schmo deal, right? If you are listening to this podcast on Spotify, you are seeing the benefits and negatives of the Joe Schmo deal. We kind of just upload this thing to a variety of different platforms that clearly are selling advertising against our sweet content. And that's maybe not the best plan if you're a label. But like, so a lot of these labels didn't want to just give their product to Spotify or whoever just because they were like, oh no, we're a very nice media company. Don't worry, trust us. So anything but that requires like a lot of negotiating, and not just negotiating in one place, right? Again, I don't know how importing exporting works, but I also like, you kind of pay taxes and then like you can get it to another country, right? That's different than figuring out the different kinds of licensing required to stream across borders or stream internationally. And so like, just from the jump, there's a level of additional difficulty and kind of like centralized difficulty, right? It's not like getting a thing from place to place and that's a hard thing to do because there's a whole bunch of like hoops you have to jump through. It's like one problem that requires a fairly high level of organization, and that Merlin is really designed to address that issue and to allow these quote unquote indie labels to get some sort of leverage against whatever new licensing opportunity emerges.
Yeah, and to be clear, like Baker's Group or XL or Sub Pop or whatever, I mean, we don't want to downplay the fact that they are independent. Like they don't have the resource. I mean, it's an obvious point, but they don't have the resources as like the big labels. And so like getting together and doing this as like a collective like made the most sense. Like it was almost kind of out of necessity, really, if they're gonna like get any kind of bag at all in this situation. And it's also kind of worth thinking about like if they didn't form Merlin, like what would have happened. I mean, you would probably see a lot of these independent labels, one, either fold, or two, be gobbled up by the majors.
Yeah, totally. Or just be offered a significantly less good deal. I mean, you also wonder, like, because again, I mean,
yeah, or like if a Spotify would even give like say like Sub Pop like negotiating on their own, like if like Spotify would even like have given them like an opportunity to like sit at the table with them, maybe they wouldn't even be interested in it. It's kind of wild to think about. I don't know. I was just thinking about and doing the research about this, like what would happen like without Merlin, and it's bleak actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and it's also important because this, and let's talk about the size of this for a second, right? Like Merlin represents something like 10 to 15%. It varies, and clearly like these numbers are all sus, but like I think like as of 2019, it represents like 15% of the overall streaming ecosystem. All those labels together, it's like what, Saxon, like 10 or so percentage smaller than the smallest of the majors, something like that.
Right. A little bit more, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's much smaller than the three majors, but it's still a pretty big chunk of the streaming ecosystem. Yeah, no, thinking about like what would happen and without something like Merlin is that percentage of the streaming ecosystem, and again, like as of last count, something like 75% of the streaming ecosystem is Merlin or the majors, right? So what you'd have is a big chunk that's a lot less bargaining power. And then, I mean, we've talked about this with Spotify more generally, right? That like if Spotify was, I mean, when Merlin was formed, when this stuff happened, it was more concentrated with the majors, but like 30-ish, a little less, 25-30% of the whole streaming ecosystem was kind of was without leverage against something like Spotify or Apple Music. You can imagine offering them much lower terms and then using that in turn as leverage against the majors. And so that this is a little bit of like a keeping, I mean, it's crazy to call the modern streaming system like keeping labor costs high so that workers get paid type situation. But like compared to what like it could have been, probably did do some really good stuff along those
It's also to
lines.
me kind of like a if you can't beat them, join them kind of sort of play in a sense. I mean, the independents aren't in the, when Merlin was formed. Merlin isn't necessarily like they didn't form in a sense to like join the majors, but they're like needed the same negotiating power that the majors have. And now when you read the headlines and you hear about and you read about Merlin like signing like an exclusive licensing deal with Twitch or any other platform, when you read those articles, it's like either all three of the major labels have also recently signed a deal with this platform, or like one of them has signed a deal and now Merlin has followed suit, or Merlin was the first one to do it and then the labels follow suit. Like they all kind of basically act almost in unison in a strange way. But I mean, that's in regards to Merlin, I mean, it's like they kind of had to play the majors game in order to allow for all these smaller labels to survive.
Yeah. And I think I want to come back to that point about the ways in which Merlin plays the majors game, or rather like maybe plays the streaming game, and this is the only way to play it in the modern streaming ecosystem. And I want to just circle back to that later, but first I think there's a little bit more there's some really interesting first off, I think it's important to note that like we don't have these contracts, right? But every piece of information we have is that Merlin gets a less good deal than the majors does. Though similarly, like, right, Merlin got a chunk of Spotify when they first licensed with it, which they later sold for a lot of money. And so they do get some sort of the version of the deal, but like I imagine they're a little bit less centralized in their decision making and a little bit less clearly less big.
They don't have a most favored nation clause. Holy shit. Anyway, sorry, man. We can talk about that later.
Oh my god.
If you don't know that, go ahead and Google it. Well, we might talk about it later. We'll see.
Specifically in relationship to Sony's deal with Spotify, which leaked in like 10 years ago, but is a wild read. It's also interesting though, like what's interesting about kind of looking at Merlin is kind of, you can get a little bit of a sense of the kind of the history of the I can't believe I'm about to say this, the digital rights management ecosystem.
Oh, hell yeah.
You can get it, and by the digital rights management ecosystem, I mean the music industry and all of popular culture in like modern times. But you can get this kind of little pocket history of how things change. So when they first emerge there in this 2007, 2008, a lot of what they're doing is like being party to lawsuits. Like they help take down Groove Shark, which is like was like an interesting, weird streaming service type deal where I believe that like you were streaming against songs that individual users uploaded and were like, this is my personal version of the song and you can listen to it when I'm not, which is like actually what Spotify was doing early in its career, but no one talks about it. But that's a different conversation for another day. However, so they were kind of being part of these lawsuits which makes sense, right? That if someone is going to get a bunch of money from Groove Shark, like it should be the Libertines as well, or it should be Grizzly Bear, right? So that
or Dizzy Rascal.
Yeah. Oh man. Anyway,
I hope Dizzy got his bag.
Dude, Dizzy did get his bag, but only with Bonkers. Sorry, that was what you're hearing right now is the deep reverie over how good Boy in the Corner is as an album, which either we'll cut or we won't. Unclear.
Yes.
Yeah. So what you get is they come out against MySpace because MySpace isn't really signing licensing deals, partially because MySpace and what you can see through this kind of stuff are these like this process of the music industry that we've come to know as streaming coming into existence as the indies kind of position themselves against other possible futures, right? Like MySpace is this very like marketplacey music as a way to attract people. It's almost like in a weird way like a proto-influencer vibe, right? Like you could imagine like if MySpace was the way that digital music went, it would be like a lot of like to fan merch sales is how I imagine that would have gone. Or maybe even like weird, like in ecosystem digital goods. You also have like,
Yeah.
right. Like in order to put you have to buy the song in order to put it as the song on your homepage. Because like MySpace was microblogging in a way that Facebook never was.
I guarantee that was like on the whiteboard at some point.
Dude, yeah, all you need to do is take us back in time and we can come up with a better musical future in the present by making sure that MySpace sees its potential as a music streaming platform. Make it happen.
Go ahead and please contact us at moneyfornothing@gmail. Okay.
m4npodcast@gmail. No, so okay, so that's one. You get them involved in Groove Shark lawsuits as the kind of free for all of the initial like blogosphere moment, right? This fascinating moment because blogosphere, like all these little MP3 blogs, which is actually like, look, I remember being like in high school and downloading Grizzly Bear's like very first EP, Horn of Plenty, as like a junior or whatever, and being like, what is this music? Right. And so they these bands really were using these kind of sites, but in some ways you can imagine as the internet develops, like giving away stuff for free doesn't work the same if you have social media like post Facebook, right? Because it just gets too big. Or if you get torrenting, where instead of downloading track by track, you're able to download like the entire discography really quickly. And what becomes like a really powerful way to get the word out becomes like industrial grade piracy, potentially. And Groove Shark's an example of that, right? So they're like involved in these various kinds of, they're in 2012, they're part of like the lawsuit against LimeWire, you know, which again is this funny thing where it's like other media companies attempting to just like go whole hog on the rights infringement that like YouTube, because it was video, just stayed just on this side of the line. And it keeps going, right? And so from that initial like scene setting, like level setting, line drawing moment, then you start getting in the early 2010s deals with YouTube, deals with a broader set of international services, whether that's like nation-specific streaming services in like Germany or, you know, in 2012, I think Japan. They're also like part of the whole like figuring out how industry centralization goes down during the period where you go from 5 or 4.5 to 3 major labels. And they're like deeply involved in through like congressional briefs and public statements in how EMI Records, which is one of the major British labels that gets kind of like cut up, scrapped for parts and sold to Warner, why it gets sold to Warner, which is the smallest of the 3 majors, why it doesn't get sold to UMG, which UMG very much tried to buy it, and why like a variety of kind of like distribution and other kinds of services gets spun out and then actually incorporated into Merlin. So like Merlin gets a piece of flesh from all of that. They're involved in like rate setting with Pandora when internet radio is really developing, and really you can kind of see step by step as you get to this moment. And again, and I think that is very indicative of the complexity, but also like the kind of directionality of the modern music industry, which is like 2016 to 2021, 2022. They're just doing deal after deal after deal with companies in Korea, with companies in China, really just trying to expand into the global marketplace, which is still like, for all of the seemingly frictionless flow of information, which we guess all know is increasingly not frictionless, is also like an insane set of like legal structures that like I'm so glad I don't have to try to figure out. And most recently it's been kind of like a set of video oriented social media platforms, so Twitch, TikTok, which again kind of,
what we're seeing here is like this, like, you know, in step with like what the majors are doing.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like you have like, there's the more digital, the more musical touch points there are, like Merlin showing up and cutting a deal, just as like the labels are, the major labels are.
Yeah, and again, I think that that shift in focus is really interesting because I mean it suggests like something that we've been kind of saying, which is that this new form of kind of like multimedia, transmedia, transmedial music performance epitomized by apps like TikTok is like clearly a big concern, and folks are seeing it as a potential like profit center, especially like things like gaming, right? Because in a way, I think that what's interesting about the history of Merlin, I guess, is that they're not the majors. Like UMG is doing everything all the time, or not everything all the time, but UMG is doing a ton of stuff constantly. Whereas like Merlin, it seems like they're cutting lots of deals, but like they're smaller, and so they're focusing on certain things. It appears like from reading through their history, from like news coverage of it, right? And so you can really see the focus shift in ways that can be more difficult with the majors.
Yeah, in one sense it could be more difficult, but it actually could also be more difficult for Merlin and actually easier for the majors if we start to consider and look towards the future as to what kind of pivoting the majors are going to do, considering that the overall percentage of streaming that the majors plus Merlin make up is fastly, maybe not fastly is the word, but like is decreasing at a considerable rate.
Yeah.
And like we could put a pin in that, and we can bring that up later if you want, because I think that one thing it's important to also remember, one thing I think it's also important to note is that it's not necessarily also very clear how Merlin cuts these deals, and then the digital service providers pay Merlin, and then Merlin distributes that money out supposedly to all the thousands of labels that and distributors that they represent, independent labels and distributors that they represent. But we have no idea like if that's what that percentage is or what that looks like.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And like at the
it reminds me of the whole black box paradox problem that we spoke to Meredith Rose about a few episodes ago in regards to Spotify and how it operates and how it's cutting deals. I mean, you could apply that just as easily to Merlin and also the big labels.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good point. And I just want to like, this part's a little bit tricky, right? Because so far we've presented this picture of Merlin, which is like fairly positive, I think. And nothing I have read in the music press like leads me to believe otherwise, except I just have like some like dog that didn't bark structural questions based on the fact that like it is literally impossible to be even Steven, right? And everything that we know about how the majors operate, and certainly how they operate in the digital economy and the kind of deals that they cut with these major platforms, right? Like TikTok a little while ago, we've talked about this before, but like there's yet another story about like the fact that they've got like a heating function where they can just like boost parts of the boost things through the algorithm. And it's like, yeah, of course they can. Like you expect this to be like fair in some like weird way? Like what does fair even mean for like a short form video platform? And I think more generally, so like given what we know about the kinds of deals that get cut, both monetary flow and just like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of relationships that like this modern structure of the industry makes so easy because it's so opaque, because you don't actually need to have like money go back and forth the way you did with payola. You just like certain things hit, certain things pay out. And so like given the fact like if Merlin is in fact doing a good job of representing the interests of these indie labels as a group to the streaming services, to these platforms, either they're kind of unilaterally disarming by not doing this stuff, which is like, I mean, maybe individual labels can do that or individual artists can do that. Like Adele, and again, we've mentioned her before, but like Adele is on an indie label. Adele, the woman who single-handedly snarled vinyl production for the planet Earth in the last couple years. Like Adele's managers can cut some deals, right? But can Franz Ferdinand's managers cut some deals? Can Jack White's manager cut some deals? Like maybe, maybe not. But like if you all, move together, if you've got the guy who knows the person who like, those kinds of relationships, that kind of structural position makes these things easier. So either they're kind of unilaterally disarming or they're doing it. And if they're doing it, who gets what favors and how those favors are distributed would be a really interesting question, especially considering the fact that some of the labels on Merlin are like substantive record labels, and some of them are like like me and Saxon.biz.
We own that, by the way. No. and furthermore, I think just to kind of add to that point is that it's kind of that paradox of the fact that like Merlin is a necessity and you kind of like want to be on the inside. And so like if you are on the inside and you have a disgruntled issue with Merlin, and not saying maybe Merlin is doing the thing like you said and is fair and a righteous organization, we have no idea.
Totally possible. We have no idea.
Theoretically say that like you were a disgruntled member of Merlin, it's in your best interest to keep that under wraps and to go internally to Merlin and have that conversation and not go publicly with it. And it's actually in the interest of like everybody else who's a part of Merlin as well, because I'm sure the big labels would love to see internal fracture at Merlin.
Or they wouldn't, right? Like there's some deals that they've made.
Or they wouldn't. Actually, it's true. Yeah.
Merlin and Warner did like some business together. I mean, like, I actually disagree. I think it's in the interest of the majors to keep Merlin around. It does seem like it's a structural necessity to have these kinds of possibilities of deals in the modern music industry, and like applying what I would like to call like my like basic human nature in capitalism filter on the position is like, it seems hard to imagine things are super even Steven all the way along the line. And then, you get the kind of same questions about like how and in what ways the internal culture or the objectives or the governance structure of Merlin differs or relates to the kind of positions that you see in the majors.
We don't have an answer for you. It's unknown.
But to wrap up, I do want to think about this a little bit more and like think about the ways in which what you were saying before, Saxon, about like the necessity of Merlin, right? Like what that necessity, which I think you're absolutely right about, what that necessity tells us about kind of like where we are as a culture and where certain kinds of what we can do, I guess, right? What we can do, what viability is in like certain sets of culturally meaningful historical traditions within the music industry, in particular, the legacy of like DIY and independent music and culture from, I would say, like the 60s through the mid 90s. Because at one level, it seems to me like it would be a real shame to just abandon the entirety of that set of like almost like like resources, right? Like resonant narratives, like cultural figures, like heroes, the kind of things that like matter in organizing or thinking through possibilities for the future, but also like blindly trying to do the same thing simply might not function because the situation has changed so dramatically.
I think this kind of thinking, it like brings up like a number of like questions and concerns. If you first look at as I said earlier, like the percentage of streams that's like majors plus Merlin and how it's like decreasing, right? And like, so who makes up, so now it's like 75%, like who makes up the other 25%? It's now what's called, as I mentioned at the top of the show, like DIY. Like DIY has become the new term for like indie, independent, whatever, right? And then I was doing some research, and I was doing this reading that like there was like some sort of survey of like independent artists, and they asked them all these questions, and like one of them was like, how many of you like want to eventually sign to a major label? And it was like 1 in 6 of the people they talked to. It was like really that's really a small number, right? So and it just brings up this question, like what then does it mean to like be DIY or independent? And then like how do you organize, how do you make a living? I always mention Maximum Rock and Roll as like, that's the actual underground. Like that's actual like independent like music now, right? Like you're touring around in a van, sleeping on couches, releasing like limited edition cassettes. Like that to me seems like the only like leftover sort of underground of this sort of history in which we've discussed, right? Like
Yeah, 'cause
the built to spills are like not doing that anymore. They probably own houses, you know.
well, yeah, no, I think that's really important because it's also like thinking about like, for one, with that like independent music, but like it's also different, like meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Like what percentage of those folks distribute through DistroKid, or like
right.
are pulled into these industry structures, or like eventually, if maybe they don't want to sign with a major label, but like they definitely like to sign with a major Hollywood artist talent agency, of the kind that like has been moving into the influencer space, right? And similarly, I mean, I think
Or even on a smaller level, just to add, or even on a smaller level, just to add to your point, like how many of them are like have their music on Bandcamp and are selling through Bandcamp, which is also part of like having to maneuver through this sort of this industry. And like, since like Bandcamp got bought out, it's like you're using the services of a major corporation, basically.
Epic Games.
Epic Games.
But like, it's interesting to think about what you're saying about this kind of like Maximum Rock and Roll, like really small scale stuff as the kind of like historical endpoint of this broader movement, because they kind of bring it back to Fugazi, which is this band that we think with a lot. Actually, like, not because they were so purists, but because they were purist and made money doing it, right? Is that like
practical purist?
Yeah. American pragmatists.
Yeah.
But like that, the potential size of ambitions of that operation of Discord Records, right, was like medium small. That you could sell tens of thousands of physical copies of a record while being completely independent and make a fair chunk of change out of it. And that in the streaming ecosystem, right? Like, I do think that it's like a fundamental change if, in order to be not engaged with the broader structures and the broader extractive structures of the music industry, you have to be so small that, like, from a cultural standpoint, it like, like a tree falls in the forest type beat.
I mean, yeah. Sorry. That point, you made a point one time. I don't fuck it. We might keep this in. Yeah, you made a point one time. I think to me, I don't know if it was on this. I don't know if it was a part of a recording or to me personally, but we were talking about, I don't know, something about pop music or popular culture, and like it related to that point in the sense that like, or maybe it wasn't even you. Maybe I read it somewhere else, but just like, what risk is there if it's just being done in front of you and like 19 people in an empty warehouse? Like, there's actually more risk in a sense when you're trying to reach a bigger audience and doing it in front of more people, which I just thought was, and which in a sense could be an argument for like it being a more critical art in a sense. I don't know if we're gonna keep that or not, but
totally. But no, but like, I think that I think that idea, right? And like, I didn't say that. It was someone else.
Okay, well, here I was trying to give you credit for something, but okay, you're right. I must have read it or something. I don't know. I keep terrible notes.
I think that like, at the same time, like, yeah, it is a certain kind of safety in that level of purity. It's also tricky because finding a meaningful relationship within this broader music industry, especially given the fact that it's so profoundly centralized, and how do you have create anything that's kind of intentionally countercultural, or even like intentionally subcultural, right? like for a medium small group of people, not the whole world, not no one, and the potential values of creating stuff within modern culture for a medium small group of people, not no one, not the whole world. Like, how do you navigate that and the potential values of that within this, like, within a system that's so centralized and so algorithmically structured, and is like the, like, TikTok as the, like, capitalist recouping, like, machine of, like, taking any human expression and pulling it into clicks and views, is like, it's a real challenge. And I think that, like, the fascinating thing about Merlin is seeing, like, at one level, it's amazing that this, like, the underground music economy that comes out of punk, that comes out of hardcore, right, that then develops into the thriving ecosystem of the 90s, that this stuff has survived long enough to have a seat at the table in the music industry. And at the same time, it's, like, kind of sad that, like, this is where it ends up. That, yeah, you get a table at the seat of the table in the music industry, and you kind of, sometimes you're slightly in the lead of the major labels, and sometimes you sign the same deals, and, like, clearly, like, the culture that you produce is kind of different, but, like, without, I mean, and there's an open question maybe, like, is it possible to create those kinds of, like, vital critical spaces and movements culturally without the kind of economic infrastructure of difference around it? And maybe that's, like, an open question. I don't have an answer to that, certainly.
I certainly have more of a cynical view on that, and, like, I'm I'm not going to say a definitive no, but I'm going to say it's a lot more difficult now. In a strange way, like, going back to your point about having a seat at the table, it's like, in a sense, you're always kind of having to play catch up. Sometimes, Merlin might be ahead of the majors and signing, some sort of, like, deal, or making some moves that, they haven't made, but, that just draws their attention to it, the majors' attention to it. But what I'm trying to make a point at is that in regards to this decreasing pie of streams by the majors plus Merlin, there was an interesting article recently in Music Business Worldwide. It was one of those, like, opinion op-eds that the editorial board writes about, like, what are the majors going to do if this number continues to decrease. And they started mentioning that all of the major labels are starting to put, like, a lot more weight and a lot more funding into, like, these, like, services that they provide. So, like, you don't have to be, like, signed to us, but you can go ahead and sign a deal with The Orchard, which is going to, offer you a number of label services. Basically, like, I'm trying to be as concise as possible about this, but basically, like,
no. Many of the resources that a label provides, you can make a kind of, like, a la carte situation, which means that you can be, and this is, like, vital, right? Like, you can be, like, technically independent while pretty much part of this major label system,
right? And so then the question is, how does Merlin pivot that way? Can it offer the same? Does it have the same amount of resources? And I mean, obviously no, but, like, can it offer the same? It just brings up the question again, where it's like, suddenly Merlin is facing, pretty soon here, might be facing, like, another existential crisis, or, where it if this ongoing trend, which I also like to say, this ongoing trend of these, like, these DIY artists not wanting to be part of any label and be completely, quote unquote, independent, even though obviously, as we just illustrated, they won't ever be completely 100% independent. They'll always be part of this sort of system in some sense. But I mean, that actually, in a way, actually just fractures and this scene, or this sort of sense of independence, like, even more. It makes it more difficult to have a Fugazi or a Merlin if we're all just out there and are, like, individually, like, uploading our hopes and dreams up to SoundCloud.
yeah. And I think that one of the things that's complicated about that, and that's complicated about, like, that level of independence, and that, like, the, like, influencer hustle culture, right, is, that sense that you need, again, it's the centralizing impulse of the internet, right? Like, you need a huge, given how cheap every piece of attention is, you need a huge audience to make money, which directs people to make certain kinds of content. And, like, again, not to, like, over valorize like a very specific economic moment that like will not come back. But like, I don't know. I mean, it seems like there's a loss in having people be able to make like some money from, not just money, just like be able to have medium small.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, even the idea of DIY is just being gobbled up and like commodified into this thing that's being sold back to you. Cut out the middleman. You don't need a major label. You can be DIY. But that's in the end just going to like, in the end, help this greater, just to put a huge umbrella term over it, this greater system.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, and that's like, no, and to be very specific there, right? Like the majors, for all of their exploitive, destructive tendencies, at least are invested in music. And like,
yeah, like, there you go. There's your silver lining.
Good luck with YouTube.
Peace.
So I think that we've wandered far enough away from the pointy hats over at Merlin. Who knows?
I'm sure that there's a lot of we recently, the last episode, you heard us doing a live taping at the Water and Music Summit, and I'm sure there's a lot of I'm just gonna go ahead and put a label on all of you, a lot of music tech heads who are currently screaming at us right now while listening about all the possibilities of technology that we're failing to mention here. But yeah, prove us wrong. Send us an email, tweet at us, do all the things. Love to know, love to talk more. Oh, and also if you happen to work at Merlin and are happen to be listening to us and want to offer us some insider knowledge about the inner workings of Merlin, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and like we are deeply, deeply happy to be wrong about anything. So like if we missed the mark on this was based on a bunch of research, but
a book on Merlin has not been written.
Not that many articles about Merlin have been written. So like, please, we'd love to have you on the show.
Music by Bird Language. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time. Bye.